Hey book lovers, I got a truly iconic book for you today. An icon culturally, historically, as well as in a literature sense. And it's a great coincidence that I am doing this book in the Black History Month and also the 400th anniversary of Blacks on American Soil, a special occasion indeed. The book is Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, first published in early 1850s, and many of you are already well familiar with the book as well as all the discussions and controversies around it. But I thought it's worth looking at this book again because it's a really special book. And I'll quickly add that while there are many editions in print, this particular edition is with annotations by Dr. Henry Louis Gates of Harvard and his colleague professor from Princeton. Now, annotated books is not something very common, and a lot of readers probably don't like it a lot. But I think it's a good tool, at least once in a while, that people can employ when they are reading a book about unfamiliar context or about unfamiliar era or circumstances or even language. All of us know the English 300 years ago is so different from the English today that sometimes even an English speaking person might find it useful to get some help in terms of annotations. But anyway, that's your choice. You like it annotated, you don't like it, that's fine with me. This book, when it was published in the 1850s, a very interesting anecdote. Dr. Bailey, who was the editor of National Era, which was a prominent magazine those days, he reviewed the book and said that this will touch a nerve with American people and will probably attract thousands of new readers who were upset with the recent Fugitive Slaves Act of 1850. Indeed so, but who could have guessed that this book will galvanize the country's opposition to slavery, become a global cultural phenomenon, and according to some, spark the Civil War. So that's how important this book became. Before we jump into the book, let us talk a little bit about the author, Harriet Beecher Stowe, a white woman. We don't say such things these days, but in the context of this book, it's important to state that. She was born in Connecticut in 1811, moved to Ohio with her family in early 20s, and then settled down there. So she had first-hand experience of Northeast as well as South and Southwest. I think that's very crucial for this whole novel, because this whole novel, the Civil War, was all about Northeast versus Southwest in a broad sense. So this gives her the necessary background of both the regions. Some of the dimensions of this book are that, first of all, I think it's a mirror to the American society of that era. Racism, slavery, slave trading, lawmakers favoring slavery or even justifying slavery, all those were the realities on the ground in that era. Second important feature that stands out is how people abused religion to justify their greed and cruelty and treatment of people based on a race. Some people even genuinely believed that slavery was good for blacks because blacks were incapable of running their own lives. Obviously, a book of this magnitude cannot be without controversies. So a lot of controversy around this book all along entire 170 years of its life so far. Some controversies, like it puts Southerners in a bad light, it's nothing but a woolly idealism of a woman, and so on and so forth. Some more serious that we will talk a little more about. But it reminds me what they say about complex societies. It is said that a complex society, whatever you say about it is true, and the exact opposite is also equally true. So that's what this book will explain to you, or kind of put it in front of you. So how this book has been written and what kind of ups and downs it had. First 100 years, middle of 19th to middle of 20th century, this book had a great run. It spawned an entire industry. And then came along James Baldwin in 1950s, a very prominent black author. And he thought Uncle Tom was the epitome of submissive blacks, virtuous sentimentality, and so on. And many black leaders, especially the younger ones in that time, really spoke ill of the Uncle Tom effect on blacks. And some blacks actually raised the question, who is the real villain here, Uncle Tom or Simon Legree? And it's 170 years down the road, and the controversies still rage, simply because this book is so important. But before I dive into the book, let me quickly read from the book itself how important the book has become. Let me quickly find something for you. By 1878, just in about 30 years, there were at least 38 editions of the entire novel, 8 abridgments, not to mention the literally countless dramatizations, musicals, songs, figurines, cartoons, and eventually film versions. Today, more than 150 years after the original publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, more than 600 editions have been published in English and in translation. Currently, there are some 150 editions in print worldwide. So this is how big this book is. And obviously, it's impossible for me or anyone to talk about it in a period of 10 or 15 minutes. But I thought at least let me try and present to you some important ones that are of great beauty as well as significance to all of us even today. So let's dive into the story now, because when the book is so iconic, many times you can spend hours or weeks talking about the impact and the peripheral issues of this book, and sometimes run the risk of losing the beauty of the book itself as a simple piece of literature without any context and anchors and so on and so forth. So this book is beautiful and haunting. Uncle Tom is a slave in Kentucky owned by the Shelby family, who are good Christians, and they are happy slaves, whatever that means. But it was a very commonly used term those days to show that there is nothing wrong with slavery, blacks are very happy being slaves, and so on. So let me show you some picture that tells us how slavery was looked at. I don't know if you can see it well, but this is how Uncle Tom has been shown. In his hut, the cabin, and he's dancing with his family members. And in fact, even the master's son, George, the white guy, is also in the cabin dancing and singing with them. So that's how beautifully the life has been shown those days. And it's pretty fair to say that a lot of people got carried away by that image. But then things can't last, so Mr. Shelby makes some poor choices, falls on hard times, and he has to sell some of his assets, which is basically slaves. So Uncle Tom, he decides to sell because he's his best asset and obviously will fetch him the most money. And Haley, the crooked slave trader with whom he is dealing, he's a particularly sly person and he wants to extract his pound of flesh. So he says, oh, Uncle Tom is great, but why don't you throw in something more? And he spots a kid, Harry, just a 4 or 5 year old kid, who is very smart, very good looking. And Haley knows that there is a growing trade in young kids that people want to groom as personal assistants or valets or whatever. So he wants to take Uncle Tom as well as Harry the kid, and he tells Mr. Shelby that, hey, this is a deal. If you give me these two, I will forgive all your debt to me and you will be square. We'll be square. Mr. Shelby is very, very reluctant to do that, but he's caught in a very troublesome situation. But Eliza, Harry's mother, hears this conversation and she gets so upset. She decides to run away with Harry in the night because she cannot bear the thought that her 4-year-old kid is going to be separated from her. She asks Tom whether he would like to join her. He says no. And again, for last 170 years, it has not been settled whether Tom's refusing to run away in such situation, is it a sign of his goodness or is it a sign of his cowardice? And I think it's a good thing that the question remains open, because then we continue to think about it. In the meantime, Eliza's husband George, who is a very handsome and capable young man, he is on the farm nearby, but his master is unfortunately very cruel. He whips him, he treats him very badly. So he decides to separately flee to Canada to seek a better life. And he tells Eliza that he will settle down in Canada, find an occupation, and then he will call over Eliza and Harry to Canada whenever he can. So you see, suddenly there are a lot of transformations in people's lives. Then the story moves to the next chapter, so to say. Eliza is on a run. She is running away from, but she doesn't know where to go. But she is running because she just doesn't want to make sure. She doesn't want to have the possibility that her child will be taken away from her. She crosses rivers that have icy situations and bad people she encounters, all kinds of things. But somehow she keeps moving forward, and she lands at the doorstep of a white family, the Bird family. A very interesting take in the book here. Mr. Bird, who is a senator, he has recently voted for the Slavery Act. But his wife is a very kind woman. She thinks that slavery is completely against Christian values, and they always have a debate in their house. But as Eliza lands at his doorstep, Senator Bird is very kind to her. Both they give her food, shelter, clothing, and Senator Bird, at significant personal risk to himself, takes her overnight to a place that he knows where she can be safely housed. Takes a perilous night journey to take her there, and gives some money to the guy, a person by the name of John Van Tromp, who runs a kind of shelter for slaves, runaway slaves, and people in that situation. Again, this is a chapter that brings out the contradiction that white people suffered. Senator Bird has voted for the Slavery Act, but at a personal level, he cannot think of not helping Eliza and Harry. John Van Tromp, another white plantation owner, he was a big landlord, but had a change of heart, and now he spends his whole life protecting the runaway slaves. So, very, very thoughtful, very, very insightful chapters that we start getting into slowly. But while Eliza's life is harsh, Uncle Tom gets very lucky and gets sold to a family by the name of St. Clair. They are very decent people. I mean, Mr. St. Clair is a very decent person, treats people well. His wife Marie, however, is particularly nasty, making everyone miserable around her, especially the slaves. Because of Marie's continuous faked illnesses and bitterness overall, St. Clair has no choice but to seek additional help to run the plantation. So he calls Ophelia, his cousin from Boston, over to his plantation to run the operations of the farm. She comes over. Ophelia, a very efficient person, very disciplined person, but she is extremely uncomfortable with blacks and slaves. Her behavior or her overall interaction with a young slave girl by the name of Topsy is an extremely important part of this book. It brings out the nuances of the relationships, how people are torn, how people want to make progress but are unable to. Very interesting stuff in this chapter. St. Clair has a daughter by the name of Eva, and she is also a young, probably 8-9-year-old, who is an angel. She somehow thinks that she sees the Christ, Jesus Christ, and she is very religious. And the most important thing that you see in this part of the book is the relationship between Eva, St. Clair's daughter, and Uncle Tom. It's really a high point of the novel. It's a very placid part of the book, but you realize that the black versus white issue is far more than just black versus white. I can probably find some picture that shows some good. Yeah, this is a nice picture with Eva and Topsy. As you can see, Eva is the white plantation owner's daughter, and Topsy is the black slave girl. But they become good friends. They are able to share a lot of things. And another interesting picture here. There you go. Uncle Tom and Eva, like I said, it's one of the most beautiful parts of the book. Their relationship, how they live together, how they respect and love each other, and how it changes the entire, what should I say, the ethos and the ambience of the house. Some of the most beautifully written parts of the book. In fact, I go back here. I was talking to you about Senator Byrd. There is a beautiful sentence here. A good senator in his native state had not been exceeded by any of his brethren at Washington in the sort of eloquence which has won them immortal renown. How sublimely he had sat with his hands in his pockets and scouted all sentimental weakness of those who would put the welfare of a few miserable fugitives before the great state interests. So that sums up the thinking of the powerful white people those days. So this relationship is going on well. Everybody is having a great life. Topsy and Ophelia are trying to have a better relationship. Eva and Uncle Tom are doing great. St. Clair and his wife, they have their own problems, but life goes on. There is a beautiful, what should I say, literary tool employed in this chapter. St. Clair's brother is shown visiting from Northeast, who is a very successful businessman. And you remember old movies where you used to sometimes see the character which is having a conflict in his own mind. They used to show two faces on two sides of the screen, and they are kind of arguing with each other, going back and forth. So I think this brother is probably just a metaphorical creation of the author to show the conflict that is there in St. Clair's own mind, and it has been written very beautifully. So St. Clair, after all these experiences, reaches a stage where the plantation suffers a deadly loss. His young daughter, 10-year-old daughter, dies, and that changes the equation for a lot of people on the plantation. So St. Clair really gets a new vision, and he says that, okay, I'm going to give freedom to all my slaves. Slaves is not what my life can be about. So he's about to, write up certificates of freedom that people can keep in their pockets and go wherever they want. In the meantime, Ophelia takes Topsy as her protege and goes back to Boston to raise this black girl as her own. And while St. Clair is trying to do this, things change. He meets an accidental death, and all the plans about his giving to freedom to slaves and everything just comes to a naught. And situation turns bad. St. Clair's wife, who is, as we have seen, a very nasty person. So she has no choice, or she probably takes some pleasure in selling off all her slaves. Uncle Tom ends up falling in the cruelest hand, Simon Legree. Simon Legree, you can probably say, is the villain of this novel, a white slave trader and owner. He hates Uncle Tom because of his piety and fortitude, even though Uncle Tom is his most productive worker on the plantation. A very interesting take in this chapter would be introduction of characters Sambo and Quimbo, who are actually colored kids, young kids, maybe teenagers, but barking and biting dogs of the master, so to say, and doing the master's bidding, whipping all the slaves, beating all the slaves, treating them as bad as they can on behalf of the master or to make the master happy. Simon Legree is particularly cruel to begin with, and these two kids think that the way to please their master is to keep beating the slaves all the time. Even if a slave got killed, it really doesn't matter. Because as you may know, in those days, a black man's evidence was not considered as evidence by the court of law. Only a white person could give evidence. So there it is. Cassie is a very important character that gets introduced in this chapter. Cassie is a colored slave person, a young lady who has had a very miserable life. Her daughter has been violently separated from her. Simon Legree has treated her in different ways over the years. And now she is kind of tired, but her spirit is indomitable. So what she decides to do to take revenge on Simon Legree is something that is a must read in this book. She concocts a whole story about ghosts being there in that house, and those ghosts, how they play on Simon Legree's hallucinations, especially after he is drunk. And all that thing is just to read about because it is beautifully written. In fact, there is a beautiful sentence why Simon Legree was so afraid of all those ghosts and images that they talk about. Let me see if I can find it. Yep, there you go. This is brilliant. No one is so thoroughly superstitious as the godless man. So Simon Legree is godless, and that's why he is so superstitious that he buys the story of ghosts hook, line and sinker, and that really causes the destruction of his own life. But the way Cassie does this is something a pleasure to read about. In the meantime, as Simon Legree is disintegrating, Uncle Tom takes a serious beating at the hands of Sambo and Quimbo, and it actually becomes so bad that he dies in one of the beatings or as a result of that. While this is going on, you remember Shelby's from Kentucky. His son George is now a grown-up young man, and he remembers the promise his father and mother made to Chloe, Uncle Tom's wife, that they will bring back Uncle Tom. So George Shelby, the young man, tracks Uncle Tom down to Simon Legree's farm and arrives there to buy Tom back from Simon Legree. But Simon Legree is too far gone by then. Uncle Tom is on the deathbed, so he realizes that there is nothing much can be done. But he waits there and gives a decent burial to Uncle Tom, which I think is a very good thing to put a closure on that brilliant life. So all that's going on, and slowly the story starts winding down. Uncle Tom is dead. Simon Legree is kind of gone, the villain of the piece. A lot of other people, a lot of things have happened to their life. Obviously, all of it cannot be said in such a short time, but I hope I have been able to give you a few ideas about it. And then the author starts winding down the story. A lot of people have found their way to Canada. They have worked hard, provided education to their children, and they are free. They are free human beings. It all feels a bit rushed in the book, but I guess there is no choice. But one thing that stands out about this book is that there are, 15, 20 principal characters in the book. Most of the time when we read good books, even they will have just one or two principal characters and a lot of supporting characters. Whereas this book actually has 15 or 20 principal, right from Uncle Tom to Chloe to Shelby's to St. Clair's to Ophelia, Simon Legree, a lot of people, Senator Byrd, Topsy, Cassie. And these names are very important because they are not side stories. Each one of them shines a light on Uncle Tom in its own way. Without them, Uncle Tom would not be what he is. So this is something that is a special pleasure of reading this book. It will be foolish and pompous on my part to try and sum up this novel. There is no way anyone can do it. People have been probably trying it for 170 years, so they have not been able to do it anyway, right? But the bottom line, this book is about black and white people. There is no doubt about that. But the question that comes to your mind is that what color are we talking about? Are we talking about the color of people's skin, or we are talking about something deeper here? Do we feel that Uncle Tom, the black slave, is the whitest of them all? Do we feel that Simon Legree, the white slave trader, is the blackest of them all? Again, using white and black as we use today. Not necessarily true, because a color, really speaking, doesn't mean anything. But more than Simon Legree or Uncle Tom, I think it is the rest of us in between that provide all the shades of grey. Without our mainly passive and sometimes active participation, the lives of Uncle Tom and Legree would not be possible. Like I said, this is too short a time to cover a book of this caliber, but please subscribe to my channel, and if you like something, if you want to know more about a particular character, I would be happy to make more sessions talking about any specific character, any specific chapter. And I also provide some links here. You can look at some other YouTube resources. You can find some places where the book can be purchased. And I hope this has been a great useful review for all of you during this Black History Month. And thank you very much for listening.